At its peak, the British Empire covered 24% of the Earth's land surface and ruled over 458 million people. But how did a small island nation become the largest empire in history? In this documentary, we will explore the strategies, conflicts, and historical circumstances that led to this unprecedented global dominance. We'll examine the impact of the Industrial Revolution and how it fueled imperial expansion. Along the way, we'll encounter resistance movements, rebellions, and the eventual process of decolonization. Understanding the British Empire's history is crucial for making sense of today's world. Its legacy shapes current global relationships, ongoing conflicts, and the lasting effects of colonialism and imperialism. By exploring this complex history, we gain insights into the forces that continue to influence our modern world. But before we get started, if you are excited to learn more about the history of British Empire expansion, be sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which part of the documentary was most interesting to you. The early beginnings. England in the 16th century. In the 16th century, England was a small island nation with limited global influence. Its population of around 3 million people was dwarfed by larger European powers like Spain and France. But this modest kingdom was about to embark on a journey that would transform it into the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Tudor dynasty ruled England during this pivotal period. Henry VIII's reign from 1509 to 1547 saw significant changes, particularly in religion. His break with the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England had far-reaching consequences. This religious shift not only reshaped England's domestic landscape, but also influenced its future imperial ambitions. Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, ascended to the throne in 1558. Her 45-year reign, known as the Elizabethan era, was a time of relative stability and growing national confidence. Under Elizabeth, England began to look beyond its shores, driven by a combination of economic opportunism and religious rivalry. The Protestant Reformation had created deep divisions in Europe. England, now a Protestant nation, found itself at odds with Catholic powers like Spain and Portugal. This religious conflict became intertwined with economic competition, as these nations had already established vast overseas empires. To challenge their Catholic rivals, England needed to develop its naval capabilities. The reign of Elizabeth I saw significant advancements in shipbuilding and navigation. English mariners began to undertake longer voyages, exploring new trade routes and potential colonies. Two key figures emerged during this period of maritime expansion: Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. Drake, a skilled naval commander and explorer, became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe between 1577 and 1580. His voyages not only expanded geographical knowledge, but also brought significant wealth to England through privateering, state-sanctioned piracy against Spanish ships. Raleigh, meanwhile, played a crucial role in early colonization efforts. In 1585, he sponsored the first English settlement in North America on Roanoke Island. Although his initial attempt failed, it laid the groundwork for future colonial ventures. These early explorations were made possible by advancements in maritime technology. English shipwrights developed new designs like the galleon, combining the cargo capacity of merchant ships with the maneuverability of warships. Improvements in navigation, including better maps and instruments, allowed for more accurate long-distance voyages. The establishment of joint stock companies marked another significant development. These organizations, like the East India Company founded in 1600, allowed investors to pool resources and share risks in overseas ventures. This model would prove crucial in financing future colonial expansion. England's first successful permanent colony was established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Despite initial hardships, this settlement survived and became the foundation for England's North American empire. The colonists' discovery that tobacco could be profitably grown in Virginia provided a strong economic incentive for further expansion. The Age of Exploration: Voyages and Discoveries. The dawn of the 17th century marked a new era for England. The nation's ambitions grew beyond its shores, fueled by the promise of wealth, power, and religious influence. This age of exploration saw England transform from a small island nation into a burgeoning maritime power. Joint stock companies played a crucial role in this transformation. The most famous of these, the East India Company, was founded in 1600. These companies allowed investors to pool resources and share risks, financing ambitious voyages to distant lands. The East India Company, in particular, would become a driving force in England's colonial expansion, especially in India. English explorers set sail with multiple objectives. They sought new trade routes to bypass traditional overland paths controlled by rival powers. The search for valuable resources like gold, spices, and timber drove many expeditions. Additionally, the spread of Protestantism motivated some voyages, as England sought to challenge Catholic dominance in the New World. John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing for England, made significant early contributions. His expeditions to North America in the late 15th century laid the groundwork for future English claims in the region. Henry Hudson, another notable explorer, embarked on several voyages in search of the elusive Northwest Passage. While he never found this fabled route, his explorations of North America's eastern coast and the bay that now bears his name were invaluable to England's territorial ambitions. The Caribbean became an early focus of English colonization. In 1624, the first permanent English settlement in the region was established on St. Kitts. Barbados followed in 1627. These islands quickly became important economic assets due to their sugar plantations. The sugar trade would become the cornerstone of England's colonial economy, driving further expansion and shaping the development of the transatlantic slave trade. (1620) saw a pivotal moment in England's North American colonization efforts. The Mayflower voyage brought the Pilgrims to Plymouth, establishing a permanent English presence in what would become New England. This settlement, along with earlier ones like Jamestown in Virginia, formed the basis of England's growing American colonies. England's expansion didn't occur in a vacuum. The nation faced fierce competition from other European powers, particularly Spain and the Netherlands. Conflicts over territories and trade routes were common. These rivalries often spilled over into open warfare, shaping the geopolitical landscape of the era. As English explorers and colonists ventured into new lands, they encountered diverse indigenous peoples. These interactions varied widely, from peaceful trade and alliances to violent conflicts. The exchange of goods, knowledge, and unfortunately, diseases had profound and lasting impacts on both the colonizers and the colonized. The Age of Expansion saw the development of complex trade networks spanning continents. The triangular trade, involving Europe, Africa, and the Americas, began to take shape. European manufactured goods were traded for enslaved Africans, who were then transported to the Americas to work on plantations. The raw materials produced by this slave labor were then shipped back to Europe, completing the cycle. Establishing the first colonies, North America and the Caribbean. As England's ambitions grew beyond its shores, the 17th century marked a pivotal era in the establishment of its first colonies. The focus shifted to North America and the Caribbean, where England would lay the foundations of its future empire. The 1630s saw a significant expansion of settlements in New England. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630, became a major center of Puritan migration. Thousands of English Puritans seeking religious freedom and new opportunities crossed the Atlantic to establish a new life in the New World. This wave of migration, known as the Great Migration, significantly boosted the English presence in North America. However, events back in England soon had far-reaching consequences for the colonies. The English Civil War, which raged from 1642 to 1651, disrupted the usual flow of support and governance from the mother country. This period of reduced oversight led to increased autonomy for the colonies, as they were largely left to manage their own affairs. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660, with Charles II ascending to the throne, brought renewed royal interest in colonial affairs. The king and his advisors recognized the potential wealth and strategic importance of overseas possessions. This renewed focus led to increased investment and a more structured approach to colonial administration. In 1664, a significant expansion of English influence in North America occurred, with the capture of New Amsterdam from the Dutch. Renamed New York, this acquisition gave England control over a key port and opened up new opportunities for trade and settlement along the eastern seaboard. The 1670s saw the establishment of the Carolina colonies, granted by Charles II to 8 English nobles. These colonies, particularly South Carolina, became significant for their rice and indigo plantations. The introduction of these cash crops would have profound economic and social impacts, shaping the development of the region for generations to come. As the colonies grew, so did tensions between settlers and colonial authorities. In 1676, Bacon's Rebellion erupted in Virginia. This uprising, led by Nathaniel Bacon against Governor William Berkeley, highlighted the growing dissatisfaction of frontier settlers with colonial policies. The rebellion prompted changes in colonial administration and labor systems, including an increased reliance on enslaved African labor. The late 17th century also saw darker chapters in colonial history. The Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts reflected the social and religious tensions within New England colonies. This episode of mass hysteria and judicial overreach resulted in the execution of 20 people and remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of paranoia and unchecked authority. As the century drew to a close, efforts were made to consolidate colonial governance. The establishment of the Board of Trade and Plantations in the late 1600s marked an attempt to more effectively oversee colonial affairs. This body would play a crucial role in shaping imperial policy and administration in the coming decades. The rise of the East India Company. As we turn our attention to the East India Company, we witness the birth of a commercial powerhouse that would reshape the course of history. Founded in 1600 by royal charter under Queen Elizabeth I, this organization began with a simple goal: to trade with the East Indies. Little did anyone know that this company would become the driving force behind Britain's dominance in India and a key player in the expansion of the British Empire. The early 1600s saw the company establish its first trading post in Surat, India. This seemingly modest beginning marked the start of English influence in the region, planting the seeds for what would become a vast commercial and political empire. By 1615, the company had secured trading rights from Mughal Emperor Jahangir, a crucial step that allowed it to expand operations across India. Over the following decades, the East India Company's presence in India grew steadily. Trading posts were set up in strategic locations: Madras in 1640, Bombay, acquired from the Portuguese in 1661, and Calcutta in 1690. These settlements would eventually grow into major cities, serving as centers of British power in the subcontinent. The company's ambitions, however, were not limited to trade alone. The Anglo-Mughal War, fought between 1686 and 1690, demonstrated the company's growing military and political aspirations in the region. This conflict, while not entirely successful for the British, signaled a shift in the company's approach. No longer content with merely trading, it began to see itself as a power player in Indian politics. As the 18th century progressed, the East India Company underwent a dramatic transformation. It evolved from a purely commercial entity into a formidable political and military force. The company began to use its growing military might and form alliances with local rulers to control large territories in India. This shift marked the beginning of the company's role as a quasi-governmental body, blurring the lines between trade and empire. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was a turning point in this transformation. Led by Robert Clive, this victory over the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies marked the beginning of British political dominance in India. The company, once a mere trading organization, now found itself in control of a rich and populous region of the subcontinent. The company's power reached new heights with the 1765 Treaty of Allahabad. This agreement granted the East India Company the right to collect taxes, known as Diwani, in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. With this, the company ceased to be just a commercial enterprise and became, in effect, a ruling power in India. However, the company's growing influence and the blending of commercial and governmental roles began to raise concerns back in Britain. The British Parliament passed the Regulating Act in 1773 and the India Act in 1784, increasing government oversight of the company. These acts laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the British Raj, a period of direct British rule in India. The company's dominance in India with the defeat of Tipu Sultan in 1799, extending its control over southern India. By the late 1700s, the East India Company had evolved into an entity unlike any other in history. It controlled vast areas of India, commanded its own army, and administered a complex system of governance. The British in the Atlantic slave trade. As we turn our attention to one of the darkest chapters in British history, we must confront the nation's deep involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. This brutal commerce in human lives played a pivotal role in shaping the British Empire and left an indelible mark on global history. The roots of British participation in the slave trade trace back to the early 17th century. English merchants, driven by the promise of immense profits, established the first African trading posts. These outposts served as gateways for the capture and sale of enslaved Africans, marking the beginning of Britain's long and shameful involvement in this inhumane practice. In 1672, the Royal African Company received its charter from King Charles II. This move granted the company a monopoly over the English slave trade, ushering in an era of large-scale transport of enslaved Africans to the Americas. The company's formation represented a significant shift as the slave trade became an organized, state-sanctioned enterprise. British merchants soon developed and perfected the notorious triangular trade. This complex system saw European goods exchanged for enslaved Africans on the West African coast. These captured individuals were then forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they were sold into bondage. The profits of their sale, along with raw materials produced by slave labor, were then shipped back to Europe, completing the cycle. the 18th century witnessed a dramatic increase in the scale of the British slave trade. This expansion was driven by the insatiable demand for labor on sugar and tobacco plantations in the Caribbean and American colonies. As these industries boomed, so did the need for enslaved workers, fueling a horrific trade in human lives. British ports became central hubs in this global network of exploitation. Liverpool, Bristol, and London emerged as key centers of the slave trade, their economies and fortunes built on the suffering of countless Africans. These cities grew wealthy and influential, their prosperity inextricably linked to the traffic in human beings. The journey of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was notorious for its brutality. Overcrowded ships, disease, and cruel treatment led to high mortality rates among the captives. Many did not survive the crossing, their bodies callously thrown overboard. Those who did reach the Americas faced a life of hardship and exploitation on plantations. As the 18th century drew to a close, voices of dissent began to rise against the slave trade. The abolitionist movement gained momentum, led by figures such as William Wilberforce. These campaigners worked tirelessly to expose the horrors of the slave trade and push for its abolition, facing fierce opposition from those who profited from the system. Their efforts bore fruit in 1807 when the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. This landmark legislation banned the transatlantic slave trade, marking a significant step towards ending Britain's involvement in this abhorrent practice. However, it's important to note that while the trade was outlawed, slavery itself persisted in British colonies. The ban on the slave trade didn't immediately end the traffic in human lives. Illegal trading continued, prompting the British Navy to take action. Anti-slavery patrols were established along the West African coast, tasked with intercepting slave ships and liberating their captives. This naval campaign represented a dramatic shift in British policy, from facilitating the slave trade to actively working to suppress it. The final blow to slavery in the British Empire came with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. This legislation officially abolished slavery throughout most of the British colonies, freeing hundreds of thousands of enslaved individuals. The act came into effect on August 1, 1834, a date still commemorated in many former British colonies as Emancipation Day. The 18th century expansion, wars, and acquisitions. The 18th century marked a pivotal era in the expansion of the British Empire. As we move from the early colonial ventures into this new phase, we see Britain engaging in a series of wars and strategic acquisitions that would dramatically reshape its global presence. The century opened with the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that lasted from 1701 to 1714. This war, fought over control of the Spanish throne, ended with the Treaty of Utrecht. For Britain, the treaty brought significant gains. Gibraltar, a small but strategically crucial peninsula at the entrance to the Mediterranean, came under British control. Parts of Canada were also ceded to Britain, expanding its North American territories. Perhaps most controversially, Britain gained the Asiento, a contract granting the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. This agreement further entrenched Britain's role in the Atlantic slave trade. But it was the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 that truly catapulted Britain to the forefront of global powers. This conflict, often called the First World War due to its global scope, pitted Britain against France and its allies. The war's conclusion with the Treaty of Paris in 1673 marked a turning point in world history. Britain emerged as the dominant colonial power, with far-reaching consequences for its empire. The Treaty of Paris brought Britain substantial territorial gains. France ceded Canada, ending its presence in North America east of the Mississippi. Spain handed over Florida, further consolidating British control in North America. In India, British influence expanded significantly, setting the stage for future dominance of the subcontinent. During this same period, a pivotal event occurred in India that would have far-reaching consequences. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, forces of the British East India Company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This victory marked the beginning of British rule in India, transforming the East India Company from a trading organization into a governing power. The company's control over Bengal, India's richest province, provided vast resources that fueled further British expansion. However, Britain's imperial ambitions faced a significant setback with the American Revolution between 1775 and 1783. The loss of the 13 colonies was a blow to British prestige and power. Yet, in a twist of historical irony, this defeat ultimately redirected British focus towards Asia and Africa, regions that would become crucial to the empire's future growth. Despite the loss in North America, Britain continued to acquire new territories throughout the late 18th century. India, in particular, saw rapid expansion of British control. The East India Company, emboldened by its earlier successes, engaged in a series of wars against local rulers. These conflicts, including the Anglo-Mysore Wars and the Anglo-Maratha Wars, steadily increased British territory and influence across the subcontinent. These 18th century wars and acquisitions laid the groundwork for what would become the largest empire in history. Britain's naval supremacy, established during this period, allowed it to project power globally. The East India Company's transformation into a governing body in India provided a model for future colonial administration. The loss of the American colonies, while initially a setback, ultimately led to a refocusing of imperial ambitions. The American Revolution: Loss and Adaptation. The American Revolution marked a turning point for the British Empire. What began as a conflict over taxation and representation in 1775 would end with the loss of Britain's most valuable overseas possessions. The 13 colonies, stretching along the eastern seaboard of North America, had been the crown jewel of Britain's colonial holdings. Their loss would force a fundamental reassessment of British imperial strategy and set the stage for a new phase of global expansion. For nearly 2 centuries, Britain had viewed its American colonies as a source of raw materials and a market for manufactured goods. The colonists, however, had developed their own sense of identity and autonomy. When Britain attempted to assert greater control and impose new taxes following the costly 7 Years' War, tensions quickly escalated. The outbreak of open hostilities in 1775 caught many in Britain by surprise. The war proved to be a grueling and expensive affair for Britain. Despite initial military successes, the British found themselves facing not only determined American rebels, but also the combined forces of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The conflict stretched British resources to the limit and exposed weaknesses in imperial administration and military strategy. The final British surrender at Yorktown in 1781 sent shockwaves through London. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized American independence, stripping Britain of territories that had been central to its imperial identity for generations. Beyond the immediate loss of land and resources, the defeat dealt a severe blow to British prestige. It called into question Britain's ability to maintain control over its far-flung empire and sparked fears of further colonial rebellions. In the wake of this setback, Britain was forced to reevaluate its approach to empire. The loss of the American colonies highlighted the limitations of ruling distant territories through indirect means. In response, Britain began to shift towards more direct forms of colonial governance. This new approach would be particularly evident in India, where the British East India Company's role was gradually supplanted by direct crown rule. The American Revolution also prompted Britain to strengthen its military and naval presence in other parts of the world. Determined to prevent similar uprisings, the British focused on consolidating their hold over existing possessions and expanding into new territories. This renewed focus on imperial expansion would drive British policy throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. India became a particular focus of British attention in the aftermath of the American defeat. The East India Company, already a significant power on the subcontinent, intensified its efforts to expand British control. Through a combination of military victories and strategic alliances, the company steadily extended its influence across India. This process laid the groundwork for the establishment of the British Raj and Britain's eventual dominance over the entire subcontinent. The loss of the American colonies also spurred reforms in colonial administration. Britain sought to tighten its grip on remaining possessions, implementing new systems of governance and control. These reforms aimed to prevent the development of the kind of autonomous colonial identity that had fueled the American Revolution. While the American Revolution represented a significant setback for the British Empire, it ultimately led to a more focused and resilient imperial strategy. Britain's response to this crisis set the stage for a new phase of global expansion. In the decades that followed, Britain would extend its reach into Africa, solidify its control over India, and establish dominance over the world's oceans. The Industrial Revolution, economic powerhouse. As Britain emerged from the American Revolution, a new force was about to reshape its empire and the world. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the late 18th century, transformed Britain from a largely agrarian society into the world's first industrial powerhouse. This shift would redefine Britain's relationship with its colonies and cement its position as a global economic leader. Unlike earlier expansions driven by territorial conquest, the Industrial Revolution created a more voracious appetite for raw materials and new markets. Britain's colonial empire became more vital than ever, supplying resources to fuel its factories and providing consumers for its manufactured goods. This symbiotic relationship between Britain and its colonies would define the empire's economic strategy for decades to come. The abundance of coal and iron ore in Britain, combined with technological advancements, enabled rapid industrial growth. The textile industry, in particular, became central to Britain's economy. Innovations like the spinning jenny and the power loom revolutionized textile production, turning Britain into the world's leading manufacturer of cotton goods. As Britain industrialized, it integrated its empire into a vast global economic network. Colonies in India and the Caribbean supplied raw cotton, while Africa provided minerals and other resources. These raw materials were transformed into finished goods in British factories, then exported back to colonial markets. This system of trade, heavily tilted in Britain's favor, generated enormous wealth for the mother country, while often exploiting colonial labor and resources. The transportation revolution played a crucial role in this global trade network. The development of railways and steamships dramatically reduced travel times and shipping costs. Suddenly, it became feasible to transport goods and people across vast distances quickly and efficiently. This revolution in transportation not only facilitated trade, but also aided in the administration and defense of Britain's far-flung empire. The Industrial Revolution brought about significant social changes within Britain itself. Cities grew rapidly as people flocked from rural areas to work in factories. This urbanization led to overcrowding, poor living conditions, and the emergence of a new industrial working class. The social landscape of Britain was fundamentally altered, with new class divisions and social challenges emerging. London emerged as the world's financial capital during this period. Britain's industrial and economic might allowed it to dominate international trade and finance. The Bank of England became the world's most important financial institution, and the pound sterling served as the global reserve currency. This financial power gave Britain significant influence over global economic affairs. The wealth generated by industrialization enabled Britain to invest heavily in its military and naval power. The Royal Navy, already formidable, became unquestionably the world's strongest maritime force. This naval supremacy was crucial in protecting Britain's global trade routes and defending its expanding empire. It also allowed Britain to project power across the globe, intervening in conflicts and shaping world events to its advantage. The economic power gained through industrialization laid the foundation for Britain's dominance in the 19th century. As other nations industrialized, Britain's head start gave it a significant advantage. British manufactured goods, technology, and capital spread across the globe, often accompanied by British cultural and political influence. The Napoleonic Wars and Aftermath. The dawn of the 19th century brought a new challenge to Britain's growing empire: Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars, spanning from 1803 to 1815, would test Britain's military might, economic strength, and diplomatic skills. These conflicts would reshape the map of Europe and cement Britain's position as the world's leading naval and colonial power. Britain found itself at the center of a series of conflicts that pitted Napoleon's French Empire against the coalition of European powers. The wars were fought on land and sea, stretching from the Americas to Egypt and India. Britain's role in these conflicts was pivotal, leveraging its naval supremacy and financial resources to counter Napoleon's ambitions. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 stands out as a defining moment of the wars. Admiral Horatio Nelson led the British fleet to a decisive victory over the combined French and Spanish navies. This battle ensured British control of the seas, dealing a severe blow to Napoleon's plans for invasion and allowing Britain to maintain its global trade networks. Nelson's famous signal, quote, "England expects that every man will do his duty," became a rallying cry for the nation. While the wars strained Britain's economy, they also spurred innovation and industrial growth. The demands of warfare accelerated advancements in manufacturing, particularly in areas like iron production and shipbuilding. These developments would prove crucial in maintaining Britain's industrial edge in the post-war years. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The Duke of Wellington, leading a coalition of British, Dutch, and German forces, decisively defeated Napoleon. This victory marked the end of the French Emperor's rule and ushered in a new era of British dominance in Europe and beyond. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars saw Britain emerge as the undisputed global superpower. The Congress of Vienna, held from 1814 to 1815, redrew the map of Europe. Britain played a key role in these negotiations, working to create a balance of power that would prevent any single nation from dominating the continent. This approach, known as splendid isolation, would guide British foreign policy for much of the 19th century. Britain's territorial gains from the wars were significant. The Cape Colony in South Africa, seized from the Dutch in 1806, provided a strategic base on the route to India. Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, was also added to the empire, further strengthening Britain's position in the Indian Ocean. These acquisitions expanded Britain's global reach and provided new opportunities for trade and settlement. The post-war period ushered in an era known as Pax Britannica, or British peace. With its main rival defeated and its naval supremacy unchallenged, Britain was free to focus on consolidating its imperial gains and expanding its economic influence worldwide. This period saw rapid growth in British overseas trade and investment, as well as the spread of British cultural and political institutions across the globe. The wars also reinforced Britain's role as a global arbiter. The country positioned itself as the world's policeman, intervening in conflicts and disputes around the world to maintain a balance of power favorable to its interests. This approach allowed Britain to exert influence far beyond its formal empire, shaping global affairs in ways that would persist well into the 20th century. The role of the British Navy, dominating the seas. The British Navy was more than just a military force. It was the backbone of Britain's rise to global dominance. From the 18th century onward, the Royal Navy secured vital sea routes and enabled the empire's expansion across the world's oceans. This maritime supremacy was crucial in establishing British power far beyond its shores. Throughout the 18th century, the Navy played a decisive role in Britain's military victories. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, saw the Royal Navy defeat French forces in North America and India. These victories established British supremacy in both regions, laying the groundwork for future colonial expansion. But the Navy's role extended far beyond warfare. It was pivotal in enforcing Britain's trade interests, protecting lucrative routes to India, and supporting colonial expansion. During the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, the Navy provided crucial support for British expeditions and settlements along the African coast. Technological advancements kept the Royal Navy at the forefront of maritime power. The 19th century saw a dramatic shift from wooden sailing ships to steam-powered ironclads. This transition ensured the Navy's continued superiority and adaptability to new forms of warfare and global policing. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 revolutionized naval warfare, making all existing battleships obsolete and cementing Britain's naval dominance. The Navy also played a key role in diplomacy. Quote, gunboat diplomacy became a powerful tool for securing British interests around the world without direct conflict. The mere presence of British warships off a foreign coast could often resolve disputes in Britain's favor. After 1807, the Navy took on a new role in enforcing the abolition of the slave trade. Anti-slavery patrols along the African coast intercepted slave ships and liberated their captives, demonstrating Britain's commitment to ending this inhumane practice. Beyond its military and diplomatic functions, the Navy facilitated the spread of British cultural and legal systems. By maintaining open lines of communication and transportation across the empire, The Navy enabled the flow of people, ideas, and institutions. This helped create a sense of shared imperial identity and purpose across Britain's diverse colonial possessions. The Royal Navy's global reach allowed Britain to project power far beyond its shores. This was key in maintaining the Pax Britannica, a period of relative peace and stability under British hegemony. The Navy's dominance ensured that Britain's economic and political influence remained largely unchallenged throughout the 19th century. The Navy's impact on British society was profound. It became a symbol of national pride and identity, celebrated in literature, art, and popular culture. Naval heroes like Horatio Nelson achieved legendary status, their exploits inspiring generations of Britons. The Navy also provided opportunities for social mobility, as talented individuals could rise through the ranks regardless of their background. Pax Britannica, the empire at its peak. Following the Napoleonic Wars, Britain emerged as the world's dominant power, ushering in a period known as Pax Britannica. This era of relative peace and unprecedented global influence lasted from 1815 to 1914, marking the zenith of the British Empire's power and reach. With Europe largely at peace, Britain turned its attention to consolidating and expanding its colonial holdings. The empire grew rapidly, acquiring new territories across the globe. In 1842, Britain gained control of Hong Kong, establishing a vital foothold in East Asia. This acquisition would prove crucial for British trade and influence in the region for over a century. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw Britain claim vast swaths of the continent. Territories like Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda came under British rule, expanding the empire's African possessions. By the early 20th century, Britain controlled nearly one-third of Africa's population. Britain's economic dominance during this period was unparalleled. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the nation into the world's workshop, producing a vast array of manufactured goods. This industrial might fueled global trade, with British ships and merchants operating in every corner of the world. London emerged as the undisputed financial capital of the world, with the pound sterling serving as the global reserve currency. The empire's influence extended beyond its formal colonies. In regions like Latin America and the Middle East, Britain exerted significant economic and political power without direct colonial rule. This informal empire allowed Britain to shape global affairs and protect its interests without the costs and responsibilities of formal administration. Massive infrastructure projects connected the far-flung corners of the empire. Railways crisscrossed India and Africa, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and troops. Telegraph lines linked London to its most distant possessions, enabling rapid communication across vast distances. New ports and shipping routes streamlined global trade, with all roads seemingly leading to Britain. British cultural influence spread rapidly during this period. The English language became the lingua franca of international commerce and diplomacy. British legal systems and institutions were introduced across the empire, shaping governance structures that would outlast colonial rule. Education systems modeled on British examples were established in many colonies, creating a new class of English-speaking elites. However, the seeds of change were already being sown. The late 19th century saw the rise of nationalist movements in various colonies. In India, the formation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 marked the beginning of organized resistance to British rule. Similar movements emerged in other parts of the empire, challenging the notion of British superiority and the right to rule. The emergence of rival powers also began to challenge British dominance. Germany's rapid industrialization and naval buildup posed a growing threat to British supremacy. The United States, too, was emerging as a major economic and political force, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Despite these challenges, the British Empire reached its territorial peak in the early 20th century. By 1914, it covered approximately a quarter of the world's land surface and governed nearly a quarter of its population. The empire upon which the sun never set had reached its zenith. The Scramble for Africa, Colonization, and Conflict. As the 19th century grew to a close, Britain turned its imperial ambitions towards Africa. The Scramble for Africa marked a new phase of colonial expansion, transforming the continent's political landscape and setting the stage for decades of European domination. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized the European powers' territorial claims in Africa, including Britain's. This meeting, attended by 14 European nations, effectively divided the continent among the colonial powers, with little regard for existing African kingdoms or ethnic boundaries. Britain's motivations for participating in this land grab were multifaceted. Control over key trade routes was paramount, particularly the Suez Canal, which provided a vital link to India. Access to valuable natural resources also drove British expansion. Gold and diamonds in South Africa, rubber in West Africa, and agricultural products across the continent promised immense wealth. The British sought to create a continuous line of territories from Cairo to Cape Town, known as the Cape to Cairo Red Line. This ambitious project aimed to connect Britain's African possessions through a combination of railways, rivers, and telegraph lines. While never fully realized, this vision shaped British policy in Africa for decades. In the north, Britain gained control over Egypt in 1882, ostensibly to protect its financial interests in the Suez Canal. This was followed by the conquest of Sudan, culminating in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Further south, the British East Africa Protectorate, encompassing modern-day Kenya and Uganda, provided a foothold in East Africa. The discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa in the late 19th century intensified British interest in the region. This led to conflicts with the Boer republics, Dutch-speaking settlers who had established independent states. The First Boer War, from 1880 to 1881, ended in a Boer victory, but the Second Boer War, from 1899 to 1902, resulted in British dominance over the entire region. Britain employed various methods of control across its African territories. In West Africa, particularly Nigeria, the British often used a system of indirect rule. This approach involved governing through existing local power structures, allowing traditional leaders to maintain some authority under British oversight. In contrast, regions like Kenya and southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, saw more direct British control and significant European settlement. The impact of British colonization on African societies was profound and often devastating. Traditional political systems were disrupted, local economies were reoriented to serve British interests, and cultural practices were often suppressed or altered. The arbitrary drawing of borders, which disregarded existing ethnic and cultural divisions, created tensions that persist to this day. Resource exploitation was a key figure of British rule in Africa. Forced labor was often used to extract minerals, harvest cash crops, and build infrastructure. This exploitation fueled industrial growth in Britain while impoverishing many African communities. African resistance to British colonization was widespread, but often brutally repressed. The Maji-Maji Rebellion in German East Africa from 1905 to 1907 and the Herero and Nama genocide in German Southwest Africa from 1904 to 1908 serve as stark reminders of the violence of colonial rule, even if not directly under British control. However, these struggles against colonialism also sowed the seeds of future independence movements. Early nationalist organizations began to form, challenging British rule and demanding greater rights for African people. These movements would gain strength in the 20th century, eventually leading to the wave of independence that swept across Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. The British Raj, India under British rule. The year 1858 marked a turning point in the history of India and the British Empire. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown took direct control of India, beginning the period known as the British Raj. This new era saw the establishment of a centralized administration, with a viceroy appointed to govern India on behalf of the British monarch. The British Raj brought significant changes to India's governance and economy. British policies focused on exploiting India's vast resources, transforming the subcontinent into a supplier of raw materials like cotton and tea. This economic strategy aimed to fuel Britain's industrial growth while creating a market for British manufactured goods in India. To support these economic interests, the British embarked on massive infrastructure projects. Railways crisscrossed the subcontinent, connecting major cities and ports. By 1900, India had the fourth largest railway network in the world. These railways, while primarily serving British economic and military needs, also facilitated the movement of people and ideas across India. The British introduced several social reforms during this period, with mixed results. The abolition of practices like sati, where widows were expected to immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyre, was a significant step. The introduction of Western education systems had far-reaching effects, creating a new class of English-educated Indians who would later play a crucial role in the independence movement. However, these reforms often disrupted traditional social structures and cultural practices. The emphasis on English education, while opening new opportunities, also marginalized Indian languages and traditional knowledge systems. This cultural disruption would become a focal point of resistance to British rule. The rise of a Western-educated Indian middle class fueled nationalist movements. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was formed, initially to push for greater rights for Indians within the British system. Over time, it evolved into the primary vehicle for the Indian independence movement. World War I marked another significant shift in India's relationship with Britain. Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for the British Empire, with the expectation that their service would be rewarded with greater political rights. However, British promises of reform were only partially fulfilled, leading to growing frustration and intensified calls for self-rule. The interwar period saw the emergence of influential leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, who led nonviolent resistance movements against British rule. The Salt March of 1930, where Gandhi led a protest against the British salt monopoly, became an iconic movement in the struggle for independence. These movements gained widespread support, putting increasing pressure on the British administration. The outbreak of World War II further strained the relationship between Britain and India. The British declaration of war on India's behalf without consultation sparked outrage. In 1942, the Indian National Congress launched the Quit India movement, demanding an immediate end to British rule. This movement marked a critical point in the push for independence, although it was met with harsh repression by the British authorities. After World War II, Britain found itself weakened and facing mounting pressure both in India and at home. The new Labour government in Britain, led by Clement Attlee, recognized that maintaining control over India was no longer feasible. In 1947, Britain agreed to grant independence to India. However, the process of independence was marred by the partition of India into two separate nations, India and Pakistan. This division, based largely on religious lines, resulted in widespread violence and one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Millions of people were displaced, and hundreds of thousands lost their lives in the chaos that followed. Governance and administration. Ruling an empire. As Britain's empire grew, so did the challenge of governing it. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the development of a complex system of administration that spanned the globe, from the corridors of power in London to the farthest reaches of the colonies. At the heart of this system was the Colonial Office in London, the nerve center of imperial governance. From here, a network of appointed governors oversaw the daily administration of colonies across the empire. These governors acted as the eyes and ears of the British government, reporting back on local conditions and implementing policies handed down from London. But the empire was too vast and diverse for a one-size-fits-all approach. In some areas, like India and parts of Africa, Britain opted for direct rule. British officials took charge of everything from tax collection to law enforcement, imposing a system of governance that often ignored or suppressed local traditions. In other regions, such as Nigeria, Britain chose a different path. Indirect rule became the preferred method, working through existing local power structures. Traditional leaders maintained their positions, but now answered to British authorities. This approach allowed Britain to maintain control with minimal resources, though it often reinforced existing social hierarchies and created new tensions. Economic exploitation was a key driver of British colonial policy. The empire was seen as a source of raw materials and a market for British goods. Infrastructure projects, like railways and ports, were developed primarily to serve these economic interests. While these improvements brought some benefits to local populations, their primary purpose was to facilitate the extraction of resources and the import of British products. The British legal system was another tool of colonial control. English common law was introduced across much of the empire, often replacing or altering local legal traditions. This legal transplant had far-reaching effects, reshaping societies and creating a class of English-educated elites who would later play crucial roles in independence movements. Education, too, became a means of extending British influence. Schools modeled on British examples were established throughout the colonies. While these institutions provided opportunities for some, they also served to promote British culture and values, often at the expense of local languages and traditions. As the 20th century progressed, resistance to British rule grew. Nationalist movements emerged across the empire, each with its own unique character, but sharing a common goal: greater autonomy or outright independence. In India, the nonviolent resistance led by Mahatma Gandhi captured global attention. In Africa, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya rallied their people against colonial rule. The costs of maintaining such a vast empire began to mount. World War II had left Britain economically weakened, and the rising tide of nationalism made colonial control increasingly untenable. The British government, facing pressure both at home and abroad, began the process of dismantling the empire. The pace of decolonization accelerated in the 1950s and 1960s. India gained independence in 1947, setting off a wave of liberation across Asia and Africa. By the mid-1960s, most of Britain's African colonies had achieved independence. The empire that had once covered a quarter of the globe had largely disappeared within a generation. The cultural impact: language, education, and society. As the British Empire expanded across the globe, it didn't just conquer lands and exploit resources. It also left a lasting cultural imprint that continues to shape our world today. the spread of the English language was perhaps the most profound and enduring legacy of British rule. English became the lingua franca of government, trade, and education across the empire. This linguistic dominance persisted long after the empire's dissolution, with English remaining an official language in many former colonies and the primary language of international business and diplomacy. The British introduced their educational systems throughout the colonies, establishing schools and universities modeled on British institutions. These schools played a dual role. On one hand, they created opportunities for colonized peoples to gain knowledge and skills. On the other, they served as tools of cultural assimilation, promoting British values and worldviews while often marginalizing local languages and traditions. This education system produced a class of English-speaking elites who would go on to play crucial roles in both colonial administration and, ironically, in independence movements that eventually dismantled the empire. British cultural norms, from dress codes to social etiquette, were actively promoted and often adopted by colonial elites eager to advance within the imperial system. This cultural influence extended to architecture, literature, and even sports, with cricket becoming a national passion in places like India and the West Indies. However, the imposition of British cultural norms also created tensions with local traditions, leading to complex cultural identities that blended British and indigenous elements. Missionary activities played a significant role in spreading not just Christianity, but also Western education and medical practices. Missionaries established schools and hospitals across Africa and parts of Asia, contributing to the spread of literacy and modern healthcare. However, these efforts often came at the cost of traditional belief systems and healing practices, further altering the cultural landscape of colonized societies. Interestingly, the cultural exchange was not entirely one-sided. As Britain extended its reach across the globe, it too was influenced by the diverse cultures it encountered. New foods, textiles, and ideas made their way back to Britain, enriching British society and cuisine. The popularity of Indian curry in Britain, for example, is a lasting testament to this cultural cross-pollination. As resistance to British rule grew, nationalist movements often turned to local languages, religions, and cultural symbols as rallying points. Leaders like Gandhi in India and Kenyatta in Kenya used traditional dress and customs to assert cultural pride and independence from British norms. This cultural resistance played a crucial role in the struggle for independence, challenging the notion of British cultural superiority that had underpinned colonial rule. The legacy of British cultural influence remains evident in many former colonies today. English continues to be widely spoken, often serving as a unifying language in multilingual societies. British-style education systems and legal codes still form the basis of institutions in many countries. Even cultural products, from literature to music, often reflect this complex heritage of cultural interaction and conflict. The empire's influence on global trade. The British Empire's influence on global trade was profound and far-reaching, reshaping the world's economic landscape in ways that are still felt today. As Britain's Industrial Revolution gained momentum in the 19th century, the empire became a vast network of colonies supplying raw materials to fuel its growing economy. Cotton from India, rubber from Malaya, and minerals from Africa flowed into British factories, emerging as finished goods that were then sold back to colonial markets. This economic system was made possible by Britain's unrivaled naval power. The Royal Navy ruled the waves, securing vital trade routes and protecting British merchant ships. This naval supremacy allowed Britain to become the world's leading trading nation, with its merchants and goods found in ports across the globe. Key trading hubs emerged as linchpins of this global network. Singapore, strategically located at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, became a crucial entry point for trade between Europe and Asia. Hong Kong served as a gateway to China, while Cape Town provided a vital stopover on the route to India. These ports, along with many others, facilitated the flow of goods between continents, integrating previously disparate markets into a global economic system. In the late 19th century, Britain introduced the gold standard, with London as its financial center. This move stabilized international trade by providing a common basis for currency exchange. It further reinforced Britain's economic dominance, making the pound sterling the world's reserve currency and cementing London's position as the global financial capital. Infrastructure projects played a crucial role in enhancing trade efficiency. The British built railways in India, for example, not only facilitated the movement of troops, but also dramatically reduced the time and cost of transporting goods from the interior to coastal ports. The telegraph network spanning the empire allowed for rapid communication of market information, revolutionizing the speed of trade. Perhaps most significantly, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened the sea route between Europe and Asia, further integrating global markets. British colonial policies were designed to favor British goods and maintain economic control over the colonies. Preferential trade agreements and tariffs ensured that colonial markets remained captive to British manufacturers, while raw materials flowed cheaply back to Britain. This system sustained Britain's global economic influence well into the 20th century. The spread of British banking and financial services created a global financial network that integrated economies across the empire. Banks like Barclays and HSBC, originally established to serve colonial markets, grew into global institutions. This financial infrastructure facilitated international trade and investment, with London at its center. Resistance and rebellions. Challenges to British rule. Throughout the vast British Empire, the flames of resistance flickered and grew as colonial subjects challenged British rule. These uprisings, spanning continents and decades, ultimately weakened the empire's grip and paved the way for independence movements. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 marked a turning point in British colonial history. This widespread uprising, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, began with Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army and quickly spread across northern and central India. The rebellion's brutality and scale shocked British authorities, leading to the dissolution of the East India Company and the establishment of direct crown rule in India. This shift in governance had far-reaching consequences, reshaping Britain's relationship with its most prized colonial possession. Africa witnessed its own share of resistance movements. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 saw the Zulu kingdom fiercely defend its independence against British expansion in southern Africa. Despite initial Zulu victories, including the famous Battle of Isandlwana, British forces eventually prevailed, annexing Zulu land and expanding their control over the region. Further north, the Mahdist War of 1881 to 1899 in Sudan posed a significant challenge to British authority in Northeast Africa. The Mahdist forces, led by Muhammad Ahmad, who proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer of Islam, successfully expelled the British-controlled Egyptian government from Sudan. It took nearly 2 decades and a major military campaign for the British to reassert control over the region. Closer to home, Ireland's struggle for independence reached a critical point with the Easter Rising of 1916. This armed insurrection in Dublin, though quickly suppressed, galvanized Irish nationalist sentiment and set the stage for the Irish War of Independence. The conflict ultimately led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, marking the beginning of Ireland's journey towards full independence from British rule. The Caribbean saw its own share of resistance, particularly against the institution of slavery. The Jamaican Baptist War, also known as the Christmas Rebellion of 1831 to 1832, was one of the largest slave uprisings in the British West Indies. Led by Baptist preacher Samuel Sharp, this rebellion involved up to 60,000 of Jamaica's 300,000 slaves. Though brutally suppressed, this uprising played a crucial role in accelerating the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, which was finally achieved in 1833. In India, the independence movement took on a unique character under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. Combining nonviolent resistance with direct action, Gandhi's campaigns, such as the Salt March of 1930, captured global attention and posed a moral challenge to British rule. The movement grew in strength and sophistication, eventually forcing Britain to grant independence to India in 1947. Kenya's struggle for independence culminated in the Mau Mau Uprising from 1952 to 1960. This violent rebellion against British colonial rule, primarily led by members of the Kikuyu ethnic group, resulted in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign by British forces. The conflict exposed the harsh realities of colonial rule and contributed to the growing international pressure on Britain to grant independence to its African colonies. Kenya finally achieved independence in 1963, with Jomo Kenyatta, who had been imprisoned during the Mau Mau Uprising, becoming its first president. The two world wars had a profound impact on colonial resistance movements. Colonial subjects who fought alongside British forces or worked in wartime industries returned home with new perspectives and heightened expectations for political and social change. This exposure to different ideas and the weakening of Britain's global position after World War II intensified demands for independence across the empire. The role of missionaries and religion. As the British Empire expanded across the globe, it wasn't just soldiers and administrators who made the journey. Alongside them came missionaries, driven by a sense of religious duty and a desire to spread Christianity to the far corners of the world. These men and women saw their mission as twofold: to save souls and to bring the perceived benefits of Western civilization to indigenous peoples. Missionaries often arrived in new territories ahead of colonial officials, establishing a presence in remote areas. They set up schools and hospitals, particularly in Africa and Asia, introducing Western education and healthcare systems. These institutions served a dual purpose, providing essential services to local communities while also serving as tools for spreading Christian teachings. The impact of missionary activity on indigenous cultures was profound and often controversial. Many local people converted to Christianity, leading to significant shifts in traditional belief systems and social structures. However, this process was far from smooth or universal. Resistance to missionary efforts was common, with many communities maintaining their indigenous religious practices alongside or in place of Christian beliefs. This led to the development of syncretic religions, blending elements of Christianity with local traditions. Missionaries often work closely with colonial authorities, seeing their work as complementary to British governance. They promoted loyalty to the Crown through education and moral guidance, helping to create a class of English-speaking, Western-educated elites who could serve as intermediaries between colonial administrators and local populations. Some missionaries went beyond religious conversion, advocating for social reforms. They campaigned against practices they saw as harmful, such as slavery, and worked to improve conditions for indigenous peoples. However, these efforts were often entangled with the broader goal of cultural assimilation, raising questions about the true nature of their humanitarian work. The presence of missionaries sometimes led to conflicts with local populations, particularly in areas where existing religious beliefs were strong. Tensions could escalate into violence as communities resisted what they saw as an attack on their cultural identity and traditional ways of life. These conflicts added another layer of complexity to the already fraught relationship between colonizers and colonized peoples. Despite these challenges, the legacy of missionary activity remains evident in many former colonies today. Christian communities established during the colonial era continue to thrive, and the schools and hospitals founded by missionaries often form the backbone of education and healthcare systems in these countries. The influence of Western education, introduced by missionaries, has had a lasting impact on the intellectual and cultural landscape of former colonies. Interestingly, missionary education also played a role in the eventual challenge to colonial rule. Many leaders of independence movements received their education in missionary schools, where they gained the skills and knowledge they would later use to argue for self-determination. This unintended consequence of missionary work highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of colonial relationships. The World Wars, the Empire under strain. As the 20th century dawned, The British Empire stood at its zenith, controlling vast territories across the globe. But the next 3 decades would bring unprecedented challenges that would strain the empire to its breaking point. The World Wars and their aftermath would fundamentally reshape the balance of global power and accelerate the process of decolonization. World War I erupted in 1914, and Britain quickly mobilized its entire empire for the war effort. Soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean were called upon to fight alongside British troops on the battlefields of Europe and beyond. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers served in the war, with hundreds of thousands more coming from other colonies. These men fought bravely, often in harsh conditions far from home. The war also saw a massive mobilization of colonial resources. Raw materials, food, and supplies flowed from every corner of the empire to support the Allied war effort. India alone contributed over 100 million pounds sterling to Britain's war chest, a staggering sum at that time. But the cost of victory was immense. Britain emerged from World War I deeply in debt, and with its economy strained to the limit. The financial burden of the war would have long-lasting consequences for both Britain and its colonies. Promises of political reform and greater autonomy made to secure colonial support during the war often went unfulfilled in the post-war years. This broken trust fueled growing nationalist movements across the empire, particularly in India. The interwar period brought new challenges. The global economic depression of the 1930s hit Britain hard, further weakening its ability to maintain control over its far-flung empire. Social unrest grew in many colonies as economic hardships exacerbated existing grievances against British rule. World War II placed even greater demands on the empire. Once again, Britain called upon its colonies for soldiers, resources, and support. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers served in the war, along with hundreds of thousands from Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the empire. Colonial territories became vital strategic assets, providing bases, supplies, and raw materials crucial to the Allied war effort. But the war also exposed the contradictions at the heart of the empire. Colonial soldiers fought for freedom and democracy abroad while being denied those same rights at home. This experience, coupled with exposure to new ideas and cultures, intensified anti-colonial sentiments. Many who served returned home with a strengthened resolve to seek independence for their own nations. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Britain and the United States in 1941, further undermined the ideological foundations of empire. It affirmed the right of all peoples to choose their own form of government, a principle at odds with colonial rule. Though Britain tried to limit this to European nations under Nazi occupation, colonial subjects seized upon it as a promise of future independence. In India, tensions reached a boiling point with the Quit India movement of 1942. Led by Mahatma Gandhi and other nationalist leaders, this mass civil disobedience campaign demanded an immediate end to British rule. Though brutally suppressed, it demonstrated the growing strength and determination of the Indian independence movement. The immense cost of World War II dealt a fatal blow to Britain's ability to maintain its empire. The country emerged from the conflict deeply in debt and economically exhausted. Its global position was greatly diminished, overshadowed by the rising superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union. Holding on to the empire in the face of growing nationalist movements and international pressure became increasingly untenable. The road to decolonization. The end of World War II marked a turning point for the British Empire. Britain emerged from the conflict victorious, but financially exhausted and facing a changed world order. The rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, coupled with growing nationalist movements in the colonies, made it clear that the era of empire was coming to an end. In 1945, the British people elected a Labour government led by Clement Attlee. This new administration recognized the inevitability of decolonization and began the process of dismantling the empire. Their first major test came in India, the jewel in the imperial crown. Decades of nationalist struggle, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had made Indian independence inevitable. On August 15, 1947, India gained its independence, but the joy of freedom was marred by the tragedy of partition. The subcontinent was divided into two nations, India and Pakistan. This division, based largely on religious lines, led to massive population transfers and outbreaks of violence that left hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced. The wave of decolonization quickly spread across Asia. Burma, now Myanmar, and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, gained independence in 1948. In Africa, the process took longer, but gathered momentum in the 1950s. Ghana led the way, becoming the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. However, the path to independence was not always smooth. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising from 1952 to 1960 highlighted the tensions and violence that could accompany decolonization. This rebellion against British rule, primarily led by members of the Kikuyu ethnic group, was met with a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. The conflict exposed the harsh realities of colonial rule and accelerated the push for Kenyan independence, which was finally achieved in 1963. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a significant turning point in Britain's global standing. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military intervention. But they were forced to withdraw under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union. This humiliation exposed Britain's diminished power on the world stage and accelerated the process of decolonization. In the Caribbean, the movement towards independence gained momentum in the early 1960s. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago both gained independence in 1962, followed by several other island nations in the following years. These transitions were generally peaceful, negotiated through constitutional reforms and elections. The process of decolonization varied from region to region. In some areas, power was transferred relatively smoothly through negotiation and constitutional reform. In others, independence came only after prolonged and sometimes violent struggles. The British government, recognizing the inevitability of change, often sought to manage the process to maintain influence and protect its interests in the post-colonial era. By the mid-1960s, most of Britain's colonies had gained independence. The empire that had once covered a quarter of the world's land surface had largely dissolved. In its place emerged a Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states with historical ties to Britain. The Suez Crisis, a turning point. As the dust settled after World War II, Britain faced a new challenge that would shake the very foundations of its empire. The year was 1956, and Egypt's charismatic president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had just nationalized the Suez Canal. This bold move threatened British and French interests in the region, setting the stage for a crisis that would mark the end of an era. The Suez Canal, a vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, had long been under British and French control. Its importance to global trade and oil shipments cannot be overstated. When Nasser announced its nationalization, it sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in London and Paris. Britain, along with France and Israel, decided to take matters into their own hands. They launched a coordinated military intervention aimed at regaining control of the canal and toppling Nasser's government. This operation, codenamed Musketeer, began on October 29, 1956, with Israeli forces invading Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. As British and French forces joined the fray, bombing Egyptian airfields and preparing for an invasion, the international community reacted with alarm. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was particularly displeased. America had not been consulted about the operation and saw it as a reckless move that could potentially draw the Soviet Union into a wider conflict. The invasion sparked widespread condemnation. The United Nations General Assembly called for an immediate ceasefire. More significantly, both the United States and the Soviet Union pressured Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw. The Soviets even threatened to intervene militarily if the aggressors did not pull out. Faced with this intense diplomatic pressure and the threat of economic sanctions from the United States, Britain and France had no choice but to back down. By December 1956, they had withdrawn their forces from Egypt. The Suez Crisis, as it came to be known, was over, but its repercussions would be felt for years to come. The fallout from the crisis was immediate and severe. It exposed Britain's diminished global influence and its increasing dependence on U.S. support. The once mighty British Empire, which had ruled over a quarter of the world's population just a few decades earlier, now found itself unable to act without American approval. In Britain, the political consequences were significant. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had championed the intervention, was forced to resign in early 1957. His successor, Harold Macmillan, adopted a more cautious foreign policy, recognizing the new realities of Britain's reduced status on the world stage. The Suez Crisis accelerated the process of decolonization that had begun after World War II. It underscored Britain's inability to maintain its imperial interests through military means, prompting a re-evaluation of its role in the world. In the years that followed, Britain would gradually retreat from its empire, granting independence to most of its remaining colonies. The crisis is widely regarded as the moment when Britain had to confront the reality of its reduced global standing. It marked a clear end to Britain's role as a superpower, with that mantle now firmly in the hands of the United States and the Soviet Union. The Suez Crisis also had far-reaching effects on the Middle East. It bolstered Nasser's prestige and popularized his brand of Arab nationalism. The crisis demonstrated that the era of European dominance in the region was coming to an end, paving the way for new power dynamics and conflicts that continue to shape the Middle East today. The Commonwealth of Nations, the Empire's legacy. As the British Empire faded into history, a new organization emerged to maintain the connections forged over centuries of colonial rule. The Commonwealth of Nations evolved from the remnants of empire, transforming into a voluntary association of independent states. This process began with the Balfour Declaration of 1926, which recognized the autonomy of British dominions like Canada and Australia. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 further cemented this principle, granting these nations full legislative independence. After World War II, as the wave of decolonization swept across the globe, newly independent nations chose to join the Commonwealth. This decision transformed the organization from a club of former white-majority dominions into a diverse global body. Today, the Commonwealth includes 56 member states spanning Africa, Asia, the Americas, Europe, and the Pacific. Most, but not all, have historical ties to the British Empire. The Commonwealth is united by shared values rather than political or economic systems. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law form the core principles articulated in key documents like the 1971 Singapore Declaration. These common ideals provide a foundation for cooperation and dialogue among member states. Economic and cultural ties remain strong within the Commonwealth. Preferential trade agreements between members facilitate economic cooperation, while cultural exchanges like the Commonwealth Games foster a sense of shared identity. The organization also provides a platform for smaller nations to have their voices heard on the global stage, offering a level of influence they might not otherwise enjoy. However, the Commonwealth faces ongoing challenges. Debates over its relevance and effectiveness in addressing global issues have led some to question the benefits of membership. Critics argue that the organization lacks real power to effect change and that its colonial legacy is problematic in the modern world. In response to these challenges, the Commonwealth continues to adapt. In the 21st century, it is focused on pressing global issues such as climate change, sustainable development, and education. The organization works to leverage its diverse membership and shared values to promote cooperation on these critical challenges. The Commonwealth's structure and purpose reflect both the positive and negative aspects of the British Empire's legacy. While it provides a framework for cooperation and shared prosperity, it also serves as a reminder of the complex history of colonialism and its lasting impacts. The future of the Commonwealth depends on its ability to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. It must balance the diverse interests of its member states while promoting meaningful cooperation. As global power dynamics shift and new challenges emerge, the Commonwealth will need to evolve to meet the needs of its members and maintain its role as a unique forum for international dialogue and cooperation. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more history documentaries, and tell us in the comments which part of the documentary was most interesting to you. Thank you for watching and being a part of our journey through history, and we'll see you in the next documentary.